This is from David on the discussion forum. And
David, it's David.
David,
Yep.
he says, I'm beginning to understand what some of you are saying about Stein's work. So I think David is, in the camp of the skeptics. He says, but one thing still...
Is David Blaine?
Yes.
He's a skeptic.
Yes.
But we love him. He's a really nice skeptic.
Yes. He says, one thing still troubles me. If there are no objective benchmarks we can measure her work against, how can it be judged? If I were to find an unpublished Stein poem and at the same time I presented it to you, I showed you another unpublished work in a similar vein produced by a 12-year-old, how could you tell the difference?
Okay, I'm going to give it to the TAs to answer. But I will say as a preface that David is participating in a long humbug tradition of anti-modernism. It's always been the case that the Cubist collage paintings in particular, where newspaper articles and other things are collaged, stuck to the canvas, and the Stein poems particularly, I mean, I studied anti-modernism in preparation for the last book that I wrote, and everybody uses the phrase 12-year-old. I'm not mocking you, David. You're participating in a long tradition of doubt, which is to say anybody could do this. I think Jackson McClough once said literally that to me when I went up to him after a reading, and I said, Jackson, that was so beautiful. And he said, no, it's not. Anybody could do it. You just have to have a computer programmer, and you have to have a source text. You could do it too. You don't, but you could. And I was abashed, but he was absolutely right. So maybe, I don't know about a 12-year-old, but maybe others can do it. I think that democratizes art. But I think we should answer not so much the challenging question about how anybody could do it, but the question about what scale do we use, what measure do we use to say that it's good. So who wants to take a crack at that? Maurice.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I approach poems thinking, how can I judge this against the tradition or against other poems in the historical context. It's more if there's a richness that's possible there, if it's a poem that excites my imagination, that provides some sort of outline that I can color with my own perceptions or memories or associations, then that's really all the criteria I need to make any sort of judgment.
Good. Anna, a thought?
I totally agree with Maurice. I mean, I think that looking at poetry just like in the context of like the canon can be pretty misleading sometimes, especially when you have outliers like Stein who are doing things that are so different. And I think it's more helpful to think of Stein in the context of where she was and what she wanted to accomplish and how her poetry reflects that than how she fits in with, more the traditional trajectory.
Right. So if she challenges narrative, she mocks or satirizes the American obsession with beginnings, middles, and ends, and therefore says, why is it that we always have to have stories that have a beautiful arc? What about lives that don't follow a beautiful arc? What about situations which don't have a middle? They only have a beginning and no end. And she sets herself out to do that, and then she writes in a way that subverts narrative. And on her own, if we take seriously her own challenge to narrative, and I think we better, because it's a very reasonable thing to ask us, why is it that we impose narrative on everything? American history, American politics, our own lives. I mean, we all read memoirs in which beginning, middle, and end is obligatory. You read a biography, an autobiography of Jerry West, the basketball player, it starts with his birth. And then there's some kind of turning point in the middle. I mean, it all goes back to, Pilgrim's Progress or Ma Flanders. It's all about conversion to something that oh my goodness, you became the thing you wanted to convert to, and then you end and die. Well, not an autobiography, typically you die, but so this challenge is, and Anna's saying is that we set the standard based on what Stein says she's going to do, and if we abide by that, if we think that's a reasonable standard and she meets it, then the poem has the richness Maurice suggests. And then, of course, you can't just do the same thing again and again and achieve the same goal. You have to vary it, and when you vary it, you start to change and condition and and all that stuff. Last word on this, Kristen.
Sure. I actually am going to disagree with you on the memoir thing, because we're going to see a lot of people who are writing what could be considered a poem memoir later that don't follow a narrative, and I know of a lot of memoirists, myself included, who don't follow narrative. But what I was going to say is I would also think you could ask this question about Emily Dickinson, whose works were unpublished before she died, they weren't published until after her death. And you can say, like, how could you measure this up against the canon? Because what she was doing was totally different, and it probably wouldn't rate well if you were judging it based on the canon of that or the poems of that time.
I think it was David Blaine and I.
It's kind of a like difficult question to answer at all, because I think you can take any of the poets that we've studied here and say they wouldn't measure up to traditional canon.
Say the same of almost Wordsworth was writing in the mud. Like, why is he writing about peasants in this rhyming? This is ridiculous. This is childlike. Not to mention William Blake. Not to mention John Milton, Paradise Lost. Huh? Seriously? That's what your project is? Not to mention Stravinsky. Not to mention Picasso. Not to mention Beethoven's Ninth. I think it was David Blaine and I, it might have been somebody else, who had a back and forth in the discussion forums about the Ninth. I mean, people couldn't stand it. They couldn't hear it. And he was famous by that point. And they put their hands over their ears. And now we think of the Ninth as the most melodious thing that's ever been done. So I think that we have to just sort of relax a little about what the canon is. And when we get to chapter 9, we're going to be looking at works that aren't in the canon yet or just emerging into the canon. And the canon is shifting. We've done a lot in the last 30 years thinking about how the canon isn't all that it's cracked up to be. And Shakespeare's scholarship has done a lot to understand this sort of aspirational middle-class guy who had undoubted native talent in putting words together, but kind of really thought through in strategic ways, economic ways, theatrical ways. It's almost an accident that it comes to the end, and we think that Shakespeare is totally canonical and the guy against which all standards should be set.